Sometimes a fire is not born from a spark. Sometimes it begins with a promise. March 17th, 2000. Kanungu, Uganda. A small brick church stood silent in the morning haze, sealed from the outside. The doors were bolted, the windows were boarded, and inside, more than 500 men, women, and children were singing a hymn for the last time. They believed they were preparing for heaven. They didn't know they had already stepped into their tomb. This is the story of the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, a cult that promised salvation, predicted the apocalypse, and orchestrated one of the deadliest mass murders of the 21st century. A movement built on silence, controlled by fear, and guided by leaders whose visions demanded obedience. And finally, fire. To understand how an entire community walked willingly into the inferno, you have to understand the world that shaped them. Uganda in the late 1980s was a country stitched together by conflict, trauma, and survival. Governments rose and fell like storms. War left fields empty and families fractured. No one trusted politicians. No one trusted the police. And for many, the future felt like a rumor that might never arrive. In a place where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, certainty became a luxury, and certainty wrapped in religion became irresistible. That's where Joseph Kibwetere stepped in. A former school inspector who claimed his visions came straight from the Virgin Mary. He preached discipline, purity, and an escape from the world's corruption. But he wasn't offering salvation. He was offering answers. Clean, perfect, absolute. And people starving for clarity devoured every word. But Kibwetere wasn't the architect of what came next. He was the mask. The true force behind the movement was a woman named Credonia Mwerinde, a former bar owner and self-proclaimed mystic. She carried herself like someone who had personally negotiated with heaven. Her followers believed she could hear the voice of the Virgin Mary. Investigators who studied her later believed she could hear only one thing: power calling her name. She enforced the most terrifying rule of the movement: silence. Followers were forbidden to speak. They communicated only through hand signs and written notes, because Credonia claimed that speaking risked breaking the 10 Commandments. But the truth was simpler, darker, and far more effective. Silence prevents questions. Silence prevents rebellion. Silence prevents escape. Inside the compound, every day was ritualized. They woke before the sun. They ate once, because the world was ending and the body must learn to detach. There were no soaps, no perfumes, no laughter, no sex, no voice. Infractions brought punishment, days of kneeling in dark rooms, repeating Credonia's holy messages until the words carved themselves into the mind. The followers believed they were preparing for paradise. Many were already living in hell. But the movement grew. It spread across districts. People sold their land, handed over their savings, surrendered their children, and followed Kibwetere and Credonia to Kanungu, the promised refuge chosen by heaven itself. Then came the prophecy. The end of the world, they said, would arrive on December 31st, 1999. The Virgin Mary would descend. The faithful would rise. The leaders collected everything, every shilling, every goat, every acre, every scrap of property. If the world was ending, earthly possessions meant nothing. But bank records tell a different story. The leaders had been quietly emptying their own accounts long before the prophecy's date. December 31st came. December 31st went. The world stayed exactly where it was. And for the first time, the silence cracked. Followers began asking questions. Some demanded refunds. Others threatened to go to the police. A movement built on absolute certainty suddenly found itself exposed by absolute disappointment. Credonia responded the only way someone like her could, with a new revelation. The prophecy wasn't wrong, it was misunderstood. The world would still end, but first, the movement needed to be cleansed of doubters, a spiritual purge, a divine correction. In reality, it was the beginning of a cover-up. Followers who questioned the prophecy began to disappear. Weeks later, investigators would find their bodies buried in shallow graves across multiple properties. The killings began quietly, calculated, systematic. The leaders were trimming the edges of their empire, removing anyone who threatened the illusion. But they knew dissidents were multiplying. They couldn't kill everyone one by one. They needed something final, something absolute. Receipts recovered later show massive purchases of gasoline made across multiple districts to avoid suspicion. Boards, nails, rope, barrels of acid. This wasn't prophecy, it was premeditation. Then came the date, March 17th, 2000, the day the Virgin Mary would finally appear. Hundreds of followers dressed in pristine white robes and entered the church in Kanungu. They weren't afraid. They were singing, rehearsing their ascension. The leaders did not join them. The doors were bolted, windows sealed, and outside, gasoline soaked the walls. The followers believed they were preparing for heaven. They didn't know the only ascent waiting for them was flame. When the fire was lit, the church became an instant furnace. Witnesses said the sound was not a scream, but a single collective eruption of terror. The heat fused bodies together. The walls collapsed inward. The promise of salvation turned into a scene so violent that even seasoned investigators refused to speak of it decades later. At first, the world thought it was mass suicide. Another cult gone wrong, a tragic but familiar story. But the investigation shattered that narrative. Propane residue marked the soil. The doors were locked from the outside. Bodies in nearby graves predated the fire by weeks. This wasn't suicide. It was slaughter. 778 followers died, not in one moment, but in a sequence of orchestrated killings spanning months. And the people who planned it vanished. Interpol issued alerts in multiple countries. Sightings trickled in. Border towns, remote villages, rebel territories. But nothing stuck. No bodies, no arrests, no confirmations. Some investigators believe the leaders are buried anonymously in unmarked graves. Others believe they fled to neighboring countries under new identities. And some believe they found new communities to manipulate, because people who create apocalypses rarely retire quietly. The ruins of the Kanungu church still stand today. Charred soil, collapsed stone, a silence that feels heavier than the fire itself. But the real legacy of Kanungu is not the inferno. It's the question it leaves behind. When people are desperate for certainty, when they're willing to surrender their voice, their freedom, their possessions, their dignity, what becomes of their soul? The leaders promised a staircase to heaven. Instead, they built a trapdoor to hell. And the silence they forced upon their followers, the muteness that choked their questions, their doubts, their last warnings, that silence is the loudest part of the story. Because faith can uplift, faith can guide, faith can comfort. But when faith is weaponized, when it demands obedience instead of understanding, when it replaces hope with control, it doesn't save, it burns. If you made it this far, you already know what this place is. Most people look away when a story gets uncomfortable. But you stayed. You walked through the fire, through the silence, through the shadows of what happened here. People like you don't just watch true crime. You study it. You question it. You see the human cracks under the horror. This channel was built for that kind of mind, for the ones who don't fear the dark. They analyze it. If that's you, then you're already part of this. So stay in the dark with us. The Sin Files will be waiting.